And, and good afternoon, and I hope everybody's okay. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a journalist by trade. I've been doing it for 50 years, since 1971 when I started in high school at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County. I was one of the hosts of Tiger Talk on WRKL radio, news about my high school. I also worked for the Nyack Journal News and the Bergen Record at that time as well. Ended up on WNEW radio by the time I was 21 in 1978, thanks to doing a scoop that John Lindsay was running for Senate in 1980 in the state of New York. Journalism 101, or yeah, let's talk about censorship in the United States. And censorship in the United States is nothing new. In fact, it predates the United States on the North American continent. That's me in Baltimore in August of 2002. And I was doing op-ed pieces, opinion pieces for the Baltimore Sun. And I was discussing with a guy by the name of Richard Gross, who was the managing editor of the editorial page for the Baltimore Sun, about an idea I had. Major League Baseball owners and Major League Baseball players were at an impasse in the collective bargaining talks in 2002. And there was talk of a baseball strike. And I said to Richard Gross, I have an idea. He said, well, what's the idea? I said, they talk about how baseball fans can never strike back, that they have to settle for whatever baseball throws at them, and whether that's a labor dispute or not, that they can't hit back at the owners and players. Well, you really can't hit back at the players, except if you don't buy tickets, because that's tied to their salary. But you can do other things for the owners. If you don't like what the owner of Detroit was doing, well, don't go buy pizza at this pizza place, national chain. If you don't like what Atlanta is doing, don't watch the games on don't watch TBS or CNN, who happen to own the baseball teams at that point. And I'm going on and on and on. And Richard said, hey, that sounds great. By the way, the Baltimore Sun was owned by the Chicago Tribune, which owned the Chicago Cubs. And so I do this piece, and Richard marks it up, and it's going to be in a Sunday paper in August. And Sunday papers, that's where you want your op-ed pieces, because most people in the old days used to read Sunday papers. Well, I handed in to him on the Thursday. He's going on vacation on Friday, and I got a call on Saturday. Oh, your story's been killed. And why has it been killed? Well, we don't advocate boycotts. I'm saying boycott the owners of other businesses. I said, what happened with apartheid and South Africa? Don't boycott South Africa because of apartheid? Oh, so by the way, who killed this story? Was it killed in Baltimore, or was it killed in Chicago at the parent company, the Tribune Company? They said somebody in Chicago, and I laughed. I said, yeah, because I said, don't buy products from other businesses. And notice I didn't say the Baltimore Sun or Chicago Tribune, but they killed the story. Censorship. Censorship has been around for a long, long time in America. It predates America. Jonas Gutenberg invented the printing press, and John Peter Zenger was one of the first people who was ever censored in the United States. Oh, that's me on radio, and yeah, there's censorship on radio, and oh yeah, that's me on TV, and there's censorship on TV. Freedom of the press, an English colony, not far from where you are in White Plains. In fact, if you go down Route 22, about 8 miles, you come to the St. Peter and Paul's Church, which is a church and a graveyard, and allegedly that is where Americans won freedom of the press. Well, not quite. John Peter Zenger was a German printer and a journalist in New York City. He printed the New York Weekly Journal and then was accused of libel by William Cosby, the royal governor of New York, but the jury acquitted Zenger. And Zenger, allegedly, the trial took place in this building, but it really didn't. It took place in a building built in that style. That's a church now. In 1733, Zenger voiced opinions critical of the colonial governor, William Cosby. On November 17th, 1734, on Cosby's orders, the sheriff arrested Zenger. After a grand jury refused to indict him, the Attorney General, Richard Bradley, charged him with libel. In August 1735, Zenger's lawyers, Andrew Hamilton and William Smith, successfully charged truth is against, or rather, truth is a defense against libel. Freedom of the press. First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right for people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Well, how does this have to do, or what does this have to do with censorship in other areas like movies? About 100 years ago, the silent film comic Fanny Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter in the death of an actress. A bisexual director was found murdered. Movie stars dying of drug overdoses. This was Hollywood, inside Hollywood. And Hollywood was a major problem, and the film industry knew it. The film industry had moved from Fort Lee, New Jersey, to Hollywood. And they decided it was time to clean up the image. And they also found out one other thing. Movies aren't subject to freedom of the press. The corrupt Will Hayes. Will Hayes was the guy who cleaned up the movies. Oh, he was corrupt. He was the head of Warren G. Harding's presidential campaign in 1920. Long time, he was the leader of the Republican National Committee, and he had a slush fund on the side. But he was the guy who was going to clean up Hollywood. Hayes was a politically active lawyer and became chairman of the Republican National Committee in 1918. He was Warren G. Harding's campaign manager and successful in getting Harding to run a front porch campaign for the presidency of the United States in 1920. Will Hayes and Harding's other handlers, they didn't want Harding in front of a crowd actually explaining things. And the funny thing about that, Harding was a newspaper editor, so he should have been able to explain things in front of a crowd, but they didn't trust him. Harding's administration was one of the most corrupt ever in United States history. The Teapot Dome scandal trial, 1926. Hayes was part of it. The oil man, Henry Ford Sinclair, and Sinclair gasoline is still around today, devised a scheme in which 25 cents was diverted from the sale of every barrel of oil sold from oil leases that were the focus of the Teapot Dome scandal. Sinclair testified that he loaned Will H. Hayes, then chairman of the Republican National Committee, $185,000 worth of Liberty bonds, later getting back $100,000. Sinclair also gave Hayes $75,000 as an outright gift to the committee. Sinclair gas. Gas was cheaper in Montana 6 years ago when I was out there. At the time of all this going on, Hayes was attempting to pay off the 1920 Republican campaign debt. Hayes later approached a number of wealthy men, told them that if they could contribute to pay down the committee's debt, he would reimburse them for their contributions with Liberty bonds. Hayes would testify before Congress, hide some facts, but that's okay. He didn't lie. He just hid some facts, but was unscathed by the ordeal. Sinclair would eventually go to jail for contempt of court. Hayes would go on to cleaning up the movie industry. And the movie industry was a problem in the United States going back about 107 years. Censorship, censorship, censorship. Mutual Chaplain specials. Charlie Chaplin at his best, but there were people in Ohio who didn't want you to see Charlie Chaplin at his best. In 1913, Ohio passed a law forming a board of censors, which had the duty of reviewing and approving all films intended to be exhibited in the state. The board could order the arrest of anyone showing an unapproved film in the state. Censorship was fine, no problem, 1913. But the Mutual Film Corporation, a movie distributor, wanted an injunction against the board. Mutual argued that in addition to the violation of its freedom of speech, the censorship board was interfering with interstate commerce in violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, and that the government had illegally delegated legislative authority to a censor board. Those arguments were dismissed by a court. They would go to the Supreme Court. Mutual wanted its films out. But the Supreme Court decided unanimously in 1915 in the Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio that free speech did not extend to motion pictures. In other words, you can't say anything you want in motion pictures, which is kind of odd because there were no talkies in those days. It was all silent movies, so nobody talked. At least there was no sound. New York became the first state to take advantage of the Supreme Court decision by instituting a censorship board in 1921. Virginia would follow suit in 1922. The United States Supreme Court, its ruling impact. Well, Will Hayes resigned his cabinet position. He became the Postmaster General of the United States on January 14th, 1922, and he would become the chairman of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, or MPPDA, shortly after the organization's founding. And his job, simple: clean up Hollywood, make all movies wholesome, make the actors and actresses wholesome as well, and everybody would live happily ever after. Fatty Arbuckle, he was a huge, huge star 100 years ago. And apparently he was charged with the rape and death of Virginia Rapp, but juries never found him guilty. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was accused of the rape and murder of model and actress Virginia Rapp. There were calls by religious groups for federal censorship of movies, but that was happening already. No freedom of speech. It was a public relations ploy to hire Hayes, and much was made of Hayes's conservative credentials, including his role as a Presbyterian deacon and the past chairman of the Republican Party. Less than a week after his arrest, Fatty Arbuckle's films had been pulled from every screen in America. Arbuckle was accused of having caused Rape's death and was tried 3 times, which is kind of unusual because there's this thing called double jeopardy that you can't be brought up again, but he was brought up 3 times. He was acquitted 3 times. In a sea of real, R-E-E-L, real trouble. Save me. The movie industry is screaming, save me. Hollywood film scandal, movie street, help us, help us, help us. And Will Hayes is going to dive into the ocean or the sea there to save the industry. Hayes' main role was to persuade individual state censor boards not to ban specific films outright and to reduce the financial impact of boards' cuts and edits. The studios were required by state laws to pay the censor boards for each film, for the film cut out and each title card edited. The studios had the expense of duplicating and distributing separate versions of each separate film for the state or states that adhered to a particular board's decision. So it was costing them money, and they wanted Hayes to go in there and say, hey, guys, hold up. This doesn't need to be censored, or we'll just get rid of it entirely. We got to save these people money. Hayes would initiate a moral blacklist in Hollywood, inserted moral clauses in actors' contracts. In 1930, he was one of the authors of the Production Code, a detailed enumeration of what was morally acceptable on the screen. That is Claudette Colbert, and she's wearing a skimpy top. She's showing a lot of midriff here, showing some cleavage, and this was deemed obscene. Now, you go to a beach, and there are women who have a lot more on at the beach, even in those days, than Claudette Colbert. Don't sin, be carefuls. Remember that image of Claudette Colbert. Will Hayes came up with a list of 36 self-imposed don'ts and be carefuls. According to Hayes, the code sets up high standards of performance for motion picture producers. He proclaimed when the new code was unveiled, it states that considerations which good taste and community value make necessary in this universal form of entertainment. Oh, here are some of the don'ts. Producers can't mock religion. The depiction of illegal drug use, prohibited. Interracial marriage, banned. Interracial marriage was banned in 17 states during Hayes' time. Wouldn't be repealed until, or Supreme Court would overturn the ban in 1967. Revenge plots in the showing of crime methods, clearly enough, that might be intimated. on the screen were on the don'ts list. Can't have it. Can't have it at all. Oh, Betty Boop. Sure, some of you remember Betty Boop. Betty Boop, the flapper from the 1920s. Betty Boop, the cartoon character. The cartoon character, Will Hayes, who wore a skimpy skirt and had a garter and showed some cleavage and all. She's a cartoon character. They had to redo her. The production code was voluntary. It wasn't mandatory, voluntary. They didn't have to listen. But it was mandatory for filmmakers if they wanted their films to play in American theaters. Betty Boop, a cartoon flapper in the 1920s, was redesigned and wore long skirts. Oh, Claudette Colbert again. There she is. Remember that other picture of her? She had that skimpy top. She's dressed from head to toe in this picture. That's what they wanted. Hayes would be leaving, sort of, and a guy by the name of Joseph Breen began heading the Production Code Administration in 1934 and began imposing not only Hayes's code, but his code. He was a journalist turned censor, and there is Breen. Here are the don'ts. Sex and relationships. Overt portrayals and references to sexual behavior can't be shown. Adultery as a subject was to be avoided. Complete nudity, never permitted. Interracial relationships, not allowed. Sex, hygiene, venereal diseases, not appropriate subjects. Scenes of childbirth, never to be shown. Homosexuality, can't be depicted. Scenes of passion should only appear when necessary and should not be explicit. More don'ts. Crimes. Crime and immorality could never be portrayed in a positive light. Criminals should not be made to be heroes. Methods of committing crime could not be explicitly presented. Illegal drug usage could not be presented. Now, in the 1970s, there was something called Reefer Madness. And I was a college kid in the 1970s, Reefer. And there was an old church movie about if you took drugs, things could happen to you. Like you might jump out of a window or something of that nature. And but it became laughable. I mean, it really became laughable. And they used that film, which basically lived up to the code in the 1930s in a hysterical way. It was people smoking marijuana and just going off into Never Neverland, so to speak. So this was a film put out by a church saying, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. And it was repurposed in the 1970s as Reefer Madness, which was one of the funniest movies I ever saw. Methods of crime could not be explicitly presented. More don'ts. Religion, ridicule of the clergy, not allowed. Religion could not be depicted in a mocking manner. Words like God, Lord, Jesus, Christ, hell, and damn could not be used unless it was in connection with religious ceremonies. This didn't apply to Broadway plays or wherever else the plays ended up, summer stock, wherever they did. The code didn't apply to stage shows. Screenwriters could write plays about subjects that were seen to be too controversial for Hollywood. You can run it on Broadway. You can run it in the theater in Cleveland. Don't put it in the movies. The code was also meant many non-white actors could not appear in films. Howard Hughes was very, very upset with the code. Didn't like the code at all. And he has a voluptuous Hollywood star by the name of Jane Russell, who, let's say, was blessed with a big bosom. And Howard Hughes was going to take advantage of Jane Russell's cleavage, as you can see. He, in fact, designed a bra for her. The picture that couldn't be stopped, Howard Hughes, great new picture of the outlaw, in person, Jane Russell, 1943's most exciting new screen star. Well, her pulchritude was the problem in this one, as you can see with the ad as well. Howard Hughes threw a fit when his Western, The Outlaw, was kept out of theaters. The film's advertising focused attention on Jane Russell's cleavage. That was a don't, obviously. Then comes the Red Scare. Now you got the code in Hollywood, and then you got something coming up that's even worse than that. It's a guy by the name of Billy Wilkerson. And he owns the Hollywood Reporter. And he decides that he's going to be the one who is going to out communists, the communists that he decided he wanted out in the Hollywood Reporter. He would wreck many careers, and this thing would snowball during the Red Scare. In July 1946, Billy Wilkerson, the Hollywood Reporter owner, editor, and publisher, started to expose communists working in Hollywood. He would name the alleged Reds in his Trade Views column and expose this lurking menace. On July 29th, Wilkerson published a Trades View column and included the names of Dalton Trumbull, Howard Koch, and 9 other Hollywood players the editor branded as communist sympathizers. Wilkerson ruined lives. Without Wilkerson and his tactics, the Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy might not have had the ability to begin his 4-year reign of often baseless accusations, which began in 1950 about communists in the State Department and becoming an anti-communist crusader. But hunting for communists wasn't exactly new with Billy Wilkerson in 1946. There were some in the 1930s who claimed Hollywood was filled with communists. In 1941, Walt Disney really went looking for communists. Disney branded some of his former animators communists, said the Screen Actors Guild was a communist front, and labeled a 1941 strike that hit his studio as a communist plot. He even contacted the FBI about alleged communist infiltration in Hollywood. And that would continue with Ronald Reagan, who was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. Later on in the 1940s, on October 20th, 1947, members of the House on Un-American Activities Committee began an investigation into alleged communist influences in the film industry. Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, Gene Kelly, who we found out much later on in life ran guns for the Irish Republican Army, and John Huston signed a petition denouncing the committee as un-American itself for probing the policies of individual citizens. Ronald Reagan would testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, or UAC, and said that there was a small clique of communists that have attempted to be a disruptive influence within the Screen Actors Guild, of which he was the president. And that's the Hollywood 10. 10 writers who were put out of work by Billy Wilkerson's accusations. 10 screenwriters and directors refused to testify, arguing that the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the freedom to belong to any political organization they chose. Congress didn't see it that way. And a month later, the men were cited for contempt and ultimately sentenced to a year in prison each. If you are convicted of contempt of Congress, you go to jail. At least you did about 75 years ago. The 10 were Alva Bessie, Howard Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., worked with his son Michael, his daughter-in-law as well, Leandra Riley, and I knew his son Rex. John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbull. Well, the biggest moneymaker for CBS in the 1950s in terms of talent was Lucille Ball. She made more money than anybody else for CBS. She also made a lot of money for Philip Morris, the cigarette company. And in 1953, she's accused of being a communist. Lucy the Red. Well, Lucy moved her family to Hollywood in the 1930s, including her grandfather, who she liked, who was a communist. And he kind of convinced Lucy that, you should register as a communist. And so she did in 1936. I intend to affiliate at the assuming primary election with the Communist Party. It's a problem for Lucy. They got her signature on that voter's card, and Red Channels was around. And Red Channels during this time period was outing communists or communist sympathizers. So some of you who had TV in the 1950s, I'm going to ask a question afterwards, rhetorical question. But This was red channels. They outed people. Americans, don't patronize Reds. You could drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This track will tell you how. Why we must drive them out. The Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. The Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of communist propaganda in America. Our own films, made by Red producers, directors, writers, and stars, are being used by Moscow in Asia, Africa, the Balkans, and throughout Europe to create hatred of America. Right now, films are being made to craftily glorify Marxism. Although I gotta admit, the 1930s, Duck Soup, Night at the Opera, Horse Feathers, that really glorified the Marx Brothers. But I don't think they're talking about these Marx Brothers. I think they're talking about Karl Marx from the 19th century. Anyway, Marxism, UNESCO, and One Worldism, and via your TV set, they're being piped into your living room and poisoning the minds of your children right under your very eyes. Some of those children might have been you. So remember, if you patronize a film made by Red producers, writers, stars, and studios, you're aiding and abetting communism. Every time you permit Reds to come into your living room via your TV set, you're helping Moscow and the internationalists destroy America. The Red Scare. The blacklist involved the practice of denying employment to entertainment industry professionals believed to be or have been communists or sympathizers, not just actors, but screenwriters, directors, musicians. That would be Pete Seeger or Leonard Bernstein or other American entertainment professionals were barred from work by the studios, including this woman who you probably never heard of. But this happened 70 years ago. Pert Kelton was the original Alice Kramden on the snippets of skits that were done by Jackie Gleason on the Cavalcade of Stars on the Dumont Network. In 1951, the original Alice Kramden in the Honeymooners comedy sketches on Dumont's Cavalcade of Stars. But she was abruptly dropped from her role. She was blacklisted, replaced by Audrey Meadows. Rather than acknowledge she was blacklisted, the producers explained her departure was based on alleged heart problems. Jackie Gleason didn't like this, but he was in no position to say yes or no or to complain because he wasn't a big name at this point. He would bring Kelton back to television about 15 years later in the next, well, it wouldn't be the next, it would be actually the next to the next Honeymooners revival back in the 1960s in Miami. Hazel Scott. Hazel Scott was a huge star. She was on locally in New York once a week and then 3 times a week on Channel 5. And then Dumont decided she was going to go on to the network. And she became the first Afro-Caribbean, although she grew up mostly in New York, color person ever to host a show on television. She went to Juilliard. She was a great pianist. She was an actress and something of a singer, although her piano playing was much better than her singing. And she was married to Adam Clayton Powell, the congressman from Harlem. So in 1950, she does have the show, but the show comes to an abrupt end after just a few months. She's named in red channels. She decides she's going to clear her name before the House on Un-American Activities in September of 1950, but by that time it was too late. The sponsors dropped her, and then Dumont dropped the show, and then she decided to go to Europe, where she continued her career and would come back in the late 60s, early 70s. And she would be on, among other things, General Hospital. Philip Loeb, he was the co-star of The Goldbergs. That's the Gertrude Berg show about Jewish families trying to assimilate, a Jewish family trying to assimilate in the Bronx to America. And he was very popular on the show, The Goldbergs. In 1955, unable to work, outed as a communist, he checked himself into the Taft Hotel in Midtown Manhattan under a false name, took a fatal dose of sleeping pills. Unable to find work, he had no money, he had a special needs child. He was with Gertrude Berg in 1949 when the show started on TV. Gertrude Berg tried to support him while he was out of work. So here we are, September 4th, 1953, and Lucille Ball gives voluntary testimony to an investigator on the House on Un-American Activities about what happened to her in 1936. And she says, it was our grandfather, Fred Hunt. He just wanted us to, and we just did something to please him. I didn't intend to vote that way. As I recall, I didn't. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, though, was a big fan of the I Love Lucy show. Might have saved Lucy from being blacklisted. Lucille Ball swore to the House committee she had never knowingly aided the Communist Party, aside from placating her grandfather's many requests for a room in her garage in Hollywood to organize with his friends. In her autobiography, Lucille Ball observed in herself a strong conservative Puritan and had a Puritan streak. She said, I'm the most conservative member of my family. It was for her grandfather, a progressive and a free thinker. She registered as a communist. Saving Desilu. Saving Desilu. Lucy was the meal ticket. She was CBS's biggest money performer. Lucy and Desi bring in a lot of money for themselves, for Philip Morris, for CBS. And she testifies, and then she decides to give her side of the story to the media. Before the filming, and she expected to be booed, by the way, before the next filming of her show. If you ever go to a studio audience, there's a guy who warms up the crowd, usually a comedian, and he tells you the do's and don'ts of what's going on in an audience, which you should, when you should speak, when you should be quiet, when you should applaud, all that. And that's what Desi Arnaz did. So he did address the issue. Prior to the filming of episode 68, The Girls Go Into Business. And he reuses the line in Heather Hopper's gossip column. Heather Hopper and Lucy were close. The only thing read about Lucy is her hair. And even that's not legitimate. Oh, and by the way, Lucy did not get booed before the performance of episode 68. Oh, she was a brunette. See? She was a brunette. Shortly after Lucille Ball signed with MGM in the early 1940s, the studio hairstylist Sidney Gelleroff changed the comedian's hair from brown to red. 1943 film DeBerry Was a Lady debuted her new hair to movie audiences and earned her the nickname Technicolor Tessie. See, she's not a redhead. The blacklist disappeared by the early 1960s, but many careers were ruined. Trumbull and Lardner subsequently wrote screenplays under their own names, including, in Trumbull's case, Spartacus. Frederick March, John Garfield, Paul Muni, Edward G. Robinson, Helen Keller, Danny Kaye, Paul Robeson, and the writer Dorothy Parker, and a host of Hollywood actors, including Eddie Albert, Lucille Ball. Writers and directors were accused of being communists. Pete Seeger was blackballed from TV until 1968. Billy Wilkerson's son apologized for his father using the Hollywood Reporter as a blunt instrument that ruined lives of at least 300 people and their families. In 1950, CBS employees had to take an oath of loyalty to the United States. In 1951, CBS created a security office staffed by former FBI agents to investigate the political leanings of employees. Lucille Ball did not work for CBS. She was an independent contractor, so they couldn't basically ask her to take a loyalty oath. Roberto Rossellini's The Miracle changes and kind of breaks the code. In 1952, the case of Joseph Burstein, Inc. versus Wilson, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled its 1915 decision that free speech did not apply to motion pictures. The court also ruled that the New York Board of Regents could not ban the short film, The Miracle, because it violated the First Amendment. This movie is a classic now. It's an absolute classic. Some like it hot. But was that a risque movie or not? 1959? After all, it starred Bernie Schwartz, Tony Curtis, and Jack Lemmon, Marilyn Monroe. It's a great comedy. The film was condemned by the National League of Decency, Catholic organization that acted as a watchdog for corrupt content on the grounds that it was morally objectionable and promoted homosexuality, lesbianism, and transvestism. It was banned in Kansas after United Artists refused to edit a love scene between Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe, while in Memphis, the censorship board restricted viewing to adults only. The code is gone by 1968. It was replaced by the Motion Picture Association of America's film rating system. 4 tiers: G for general audience, all ages; M for mature audiences, people over the age of 12; R for restricted, children under 16 must be accompanied by an adult; and X for extremely graphic, only people 18 and over will be admitted. As I said, I was in Rockland County, and I graduated high school in 1973. And I already had 2 years of journalism under my belt, and I was a year ahead in school too. So I'm only 17 years old when I graduated high school. I was thrown out of kindergarten, put in the first grade. Can't imagine why. But anyway, 1973, the Supreme Court said that community standards must be taken into account when determining if something was obscene or not. In the town of Clarkstown, New York, I was in Ramapo, New York, and right over the border on New Hempstead Road, where the comedian Myron Cohn lived. He lived on the Ramapo side of the border. You might remember Myron Cohn. You haven't lived until you go to Myron Cohn's house. Well, you can't do it now. And he answers the door in his bathrobe and his socks. Anyway, I did once as a reporter. In the town of Clarkstown, local officials established a 9-man obscenity committee to screen movies, cabaret acts, and printing matter. The town selected Marty Snyder, a blind 60-year-old retired restaurateur and businessman, to head that committee. Well, the obscenity committee would fade into oblivion pretty quickly. Marty was the head of it. He said he knew obscenity, even though he couldn't see it, but he knew it. Banned Lady Chatterley's Lover, the book. That was written in 1928 by D.H. Lawrence. But the Postmaster General, Arthur Somerville, in 1959 banned the book, which was first published in a private edition in 1928 in Florence, Italy. The novel was censored in the United States and the UK for 30 years because of its sexual content. It is read by school children, high school kids today. A federal district court in New York on July 21st, 1959, declared Lady Chatterley's Lover was not obscene and opened the way for its publication and distribution. Banned in Boston. A couple of weeks ago, I did this talk, and there was a woman from Boston, and I could see she's jumping up. And she wants to hear about this banned in Boston because she went to Boston, lived in Boston. The Watch and Ward Society crusade against books, burlesque, and social evil in Boston. Banned in Boston was a phrase employed from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century to describe a literary work, song, or motion picture or play that had been prohibited from distribution or exhibition in Boston, Massachusetts. Boston officials had wide authority to ban works featuring objectionable content and ban works with sexual content or foul language. The Watch and Ward Society, or the New England Society for the Suppression of Vice, devoted itself to shutting down gambling operations, burlesque halls, and brothels. But they were most famous, however, for their censorship of books, magazines, and plays, giving birth to the phrase banned in Boston. Oh, Hemingway, banned in Boston. So is Faulkner. So is Huxley. So is Sinclair Lewis. So is Eugene O'Neill, Upton Sinclair, Voltaire, Walt Whitman, and H.G. Wells. I guess, I don't know, Men in the Moon. I don't know what the Men in the Moon did to be banned in Boston, but they were banned in Boston. Network TV news started in 1948, but the modern version of network TV news started in 1949, and it was called, it was with John Cameron Swayze, and it was called the Camel News Caravan. The makers of Camel cigarettes bring you the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. And it's this guy here, John Cameron Swayze. And he looks the part of the anchor man. He's well dressed, and he's got the hair, and he's got even that little flower in his lapel and all of that stuff. He was the face. Starts February 14th, 1949, runs every evening, 15 minutes a shot. Most shows were 15 minutes a shot back in those days, including the Hazel Scott Show. And R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco company, hands over its news production to NBC and says, do what you want, except NBC News reports were not allowed to show no smoking signs. The only news figure permitted to be seen smoking a cigar was Winston Churchill. NBC asked R.J. Reynolds, can we broadcast news special reports on the Korean War? Starts in 1950. Can't. Censorship, censorship, censorship. Meanwhile, over at CBS, Bill Paley, wow, he cornered the market in censorship. Bill Paley erected 2 towers of power, one for entertainment, one for news. 60 Minutes creator Don Hewitt, real name Don Horowitz, said in his autobiography, Tell Me a Story. And he decreed there would be no bridge between them. In short, Paley was the guy who put Frank Sinatra and Edward R. Murrow on radio and 60 Minutes on TV, and they weren't supposed to intersect. But they did. Edward R. Murrow, well, he's hired by CBS in the 1930s. He's not even supposed to be on the air, and he's doing a lot of things. He's there for the London Blitzkrieg, and eventually he would host a show called Hear It Now. And that would move into TV and would be called See It Now. And Morrow and Fred Friendly had to learn the process of filmmaking with the primitive television equipment of the day. In 1954, Edward R. Murrow takes down Joe McCarthy. March 9th, 1954, See It Now. Morrow's report on Senator McCarthy uses McCarthy's words against McCarthy. And McCarthy wants equal time. Morrow has to give it to him. And they do. April 6, 1954. And CBS really wants nothing to do with the show. CBS is not promoting the show, not using the CBS I logo. And Morrow eviscerates McCarthy. And it's the beginning and the end for McCarthy. He'd have the Army Senate hearings, and then he'd be censured by the Senate. But Morrow would put him on the skids. Morrow's reporting basically brought him into repeated conflicts with the CBS chairman, William Paley. See It Now ends in 1958 after they have a fight in the office. But the censorship would continue. Morrow complained to Paley he could not continue doing the show if the network repeatedly provided equal time to subjects who he felt wronged by the program. By 1960, Morrow had enough, left. His last show, Harvest of Shame, which is up on YouTube now, and you can watch it, and it's 2021. But if you watch the show, which is done in black and white, 1960, it's the same show as today. It shows the plight of American migrant agricultural workers. Not much has changed in 61 years since Morrow did that show. Howard K. Smith was one of Morrow's boys. In fact, there was a girl, Shirley Worsper, who was part of Morrow's boys. So she couldn't tell William Paley that she was married to Joe Worsper because married couples couldn't work at CBS, except for Lucy and Desi, but that was a different story entirely. Howard K. Smith decides he's going to editorialize on one of the specials about the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama. After giving an account of blood flowing in the streets, Smith ended his planned documentary with a quotation from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Now that was enough to get Bill Paley really, really incensed. The network powers summoned Smith to New York. He's told his commentary violated standards of objectivity. Paley says to Smith, I heard all this junk before. If that's what you believe, you'd better go somewhere else. He had to. He was fired. Smothers Brothers also fired. Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour ends on April 4th, 1969, when Paley cancels the program. There were 72 shows. There's Paley. Comedy Hour was one of 2 primetime shows featuring any political commentary, and 3 in the 1960s. That was the week that was on NBC back in 64, 65. The other was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which was running at the same time as the Smothers Brothers. In the 1968-69 season premiere, CBS deleted the entire segment of Harry Belafonte singing Lord Don't Stop the Carnival against the backdrop of the riots at the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention, along with 2 lines of satire about their main competition, Bonanza. I don't get it. What'd they do? Hop Singh is a terrible cook. Is that what they complained about? Anyway, they cut out those lines. Paley and CBS not only cut out Belafonte's number completely, but added insult to injury by replacing it with a 5-minute campaign ad from the Republican presidential nominee Richard Nixon. You gotta remember, anybody who was going to vote for Nixon was not going to watch the Smothers Brothers show, and Nixon was the one. CBS ran a rerun on March 9, 1969, replacing a show which Joan Baez talked about her husband, David Harris, who was entering jail after refusing military service. That's cut, snip. And the comedian Jackie Mason, who recently passed away, made a joke about children playing doctor. Snip, gone. But David Steinberg was the one that really ended the Smothers Brothers show. Now, the Smothers Brothers show was supposed to be taped 10 days in advance so the censors could look at it and cut out what they wanted to. Well, apparently, the David Steinberg skit put it over the top. David Steinberg grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. His father was a rabbi. So every Saturday, he would hear a sermon. On the Smothers Brothers show, there was the David Steinberg sermonettes, which were satirical in nature. He had one sermon about Moses in the burning bush, and it was that skit that pushed Paley to cancel the show. And him, who I first encountered in 1985, he was not a Smothers Brothers fan. In fact, Nixon pushed for greater government control of broadcast media at the same time. Well-placed Nixon allies, CBS programming chief Robert Wood, who canceled the show, and the TV guide publisher Walter Annenberg, who now is some sort of hero to journalism because he left money behind for museums. But I guess you pay for your status, right? Adapted hardline stances against the Smothers Brothers. And there was a lot of tension because radio and TV as a news medium, TV now, radio not so much because there's hardly any radio news left, depends on its existence upon government license. And Nixon would begin to threaten to revoke radio station or TV station licenses from owners that he viewed as the enemy. Newspapers had no restrictions. Spiro Agnew, the vice president. Let me do this radio style. November 13th, Des Moines, Iowa. Vice President Spiro Agnew accuses network TV news departments of bias and distortion. Perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the networks in New York. Shot right across the bow. Networks become afraid. Pat Buchanan, who was a columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, writes the anti-network news speech, which is kind of ironic because he made most of his money later on by being on network news like CNN. The nattering nabobs of negativism. That was William Safire. Buchanan and Safire were Nixon's speechwriters. It had a chilling impact. The Nixon's White House strategy was declaring war on the American news media. Former St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist Patrick Buchanan and William Safire stoked the flames. Safire wrote the words for Agnew, went on to writing a column for the New York Times. Daniel Shore, he was on Nixon's enemy list. Apparently, he was too good of a reporter. Nixon's enemy list was the informal name of what started out as a list of the President of the United States, Richard Nixon's major political opponents, compiled by Charles Colson, written by George T. Bell, an assistant to Colson and special counsel to the White House, and sent in memorandum to White House counsel John Dean on September 9th, 1971. Shore was on the list, as was Paul Newman, who marched with Martin Luther King in the South during demonstrations and protests in March. 2008, released transcripts of Richard Nixon's Oval Office tapes had Nixon talking about, the press is the enemy, the establishment's the enemy, the professors are the enemy. Oh, the censored T-shirt. Abby Hoffman wore that shirt. So did Roy Rogers. Merv Griffin. Merv Griffin had a great gig. Syndicated TV. All over the place in terms of where you could catch him. But if you caught him, He had advertising, and CBS hires Merv Griffin. CBS was uncomfortable with the guests that Griffin wanted. Griffin was going up against Johnny Carson, which is kind of interesting because Carson's brother was Griffin's right-hand man on the TV show. And they knew each other from the Goodson Todman days when Johnny was on To Tell the Truth and Merv was hosting a show called Play Your Hunch for Goodson Todman Productions. Anyway, these people spoke out against the war. Now, one thing about Merv Griffin, he was a card-carrying Republican. However, on his show, you would never know that because he would bring on political activists like Abby Hoffman. And in April 1970, CBS blurred the video of Hoffman so viewers at home could not see his trademark American flag patterned shirt, even though other guests like Roy Rogers had worn the same shirt about 3 weeks earlier, uncensored. Griffin disliked the censorship imposed by CBS and complained. He said, "I've had enough of it," quits, and goes back to syndication in 1972. Watergate. 1972, Paley ordered the shortening of a second installment of a two-part CBS evening news series on Watergate after he was contacted by Charles Colson, an aide to Richard Nixon. Paley ordered the banishment of instant analysis by his newspeople following the presidential addresses. Paley's reporters took umbrage with what they believed was censorship of their reporting in the Watergate piece and felt that traditionally they enjoyed the ability to sway public opinion with their instant analysis following presidential addresses. It's no longer Tiffany. It was no longer Tiffany when I was there about 15 years ago. There's my CBS card. Morrow and Cronkite, distant memories. Daniel Ellsberg, who is still in the news all these years later in 2021, he released some classified information from 1958 that Dwight Eisenhower was ready to bomb China over their differences with Taiwan. That came out this year, 63 years later. Daniel Ellsberg, a government consultant, gained access to some of the classified documents and leaked them to the New York Times in June 1971. The reports revealed many large-scale attacks that the U.S. in Vietnam that the U.S. public was not aware of. The general feeling was the United States government misled the public and withheld the truth. The Pentagon Papers, a bestseller. The Times is slapped with an injunction ordered to stop publication. Ellsberg provided the Pentagon Papers to the Washington Post and 15 other newspapers. The case, entitled New York Times Company versus the United States, ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court, which on June 30th, 1971, issued a landmark 6-3 decision authorizing the newspaper to print the Pentagon Papers without risk of government censorship or censure. For leaking the papers, Ellsberg was charged with theft, conspiracy, and violation of the Espionage Act, and probably should have gone to jail, except Nixon and his boys weren't that smart. On Nixon's behalf, E. Howard Hunt drafted a proposal to neutralize Ellsberg, leading to the Dr. Fielding operation. It was done by the White House plumbers. Their first task, the burglary of the office of Daniel Ellsberg's Los Angeles psychiatrist, Louis J. Fielding, in an effort to uncover evidence to discredit Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. The White House plumbers, Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, went on to a great radio and TV career. James McCourt, Chuck Colson. The White House created a unit to ensure internal security, the unit called the plumbers, because they stopped leaks in 71. They go to Fielding's office. The first time I found out about the break-in, Ellsberg said, was when the government prosecutors revealed it to the judge, and he told my lawyers. Nixon wanted that information withheld. He'd been warned that this could make him criminally liable. The judge cited government misconduct and dismissed all charges. Ellsberg is off the hook because the Nixon people committed a crime. Dr. Frank Stanton was one of the people running CBS in the early 1970s. He's threatened with jail. CBS had broadcast an hour-long investigative report called The Selling of the Pentagon, $30 million campaign by the Defense Department to improve its image. The House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee demanded he turn over material cut from the program. He refused. He's called before the committee. And he says, if newsmen are told their notes, notice newsmen, not news people or women, told their notes, films, and tapes will be subject to compulsory process so that the government can determine whether the news has been satisfactorily edited. The scope, the nature, and vigor of their news reporting will be inevitably curtailed. Watergate, a watershed moment in journalism. No self-censorship here by the Washington Post. It could have killed the story. Katharine Graham could have killed the story. Ben Bradley could have killed the story. It would have been the end of that. Just would have been a local burglary committed by some two-bit hoods in Washington, D.C. That is Bob Woodward, Robert Woodward, and Carl Bernstein. June 19, 1972. Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward revealed that one of the Watergate burglars, James McCourt, was a Republican Party security aide, and Nixon has to go to war again against the media. Nixon had compiled the press enemies and had them audited, including Dick Cavett, head of the show, the Dick Cavett Show on ABC. His surrogates even mounted the campaign to yank the license of the television station owned by the Washington Post, which broke the Watergate scandal and published parts of the Pentagon Papers. Obviously, that reporting led to the downfall of Richard Nixon, who resigned as president August 9th, 1974. CBS censorship continued into the 1990s. That is Lowell Bergman. Lowell Bergman ended up on Frontline on PBS. CBS again, tobacco cover-up. In the 1980s, Lowell Bergman became a producer for CBS 60 Minutes. But it was a story about big tobacco later adapted for a film that made Bergman a star in his own right. 1993, Bergman received a box on his doorstep in Berkeley, California. Sent anonymously, contained internal documents from the tobacco company Philip Morris. For help with analyzing the material, Bergman contacted Jeffrey Wingate, a former head of research for tobacco company Brown and Williamson. B&W fired Wingate and had him sign a strict confidentiality agreements. That meant he couldn't talk to Bergman about his issues with Brown and Williamson, but 60 Minutes started to pay him as a consultant for an investigative story about fire-safe cigarettes. He eventually agreed to an interview with Bergman in 1995. And there was the interview. CBS lawyers didn't want to air the story. They wanted to air the story. There were reasons for that, business reasons for that. A year before, 1994, 7 tobacco CEOs testified before Congress about the possible side effects of their company's products. All 7 said under oath they believed that nicotine was not addictive. Months later, the Justice Department opened a criminal investigation of the CEOs, charging that they had committed perjury. One of those CEOs was Andrew Tisch, the son of CBS chairman Lawrence Tisch, who, by the way, started cutting the news departments at CBS in 1989. Fired some friends of mine by that point. And there was also a merger between Westinghouse and CBS that was going on at the time, and they didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to impact that merger that was taking place. If the $5.4 billion deal went through, the top executives at CBS were going to make millions of dollars. The news outlet didn't want to air the tobacco report for personal reasons, according to Bergman, because they worried a lawsuit by a tobacco company could jeopardize that merger. At one point, Bergman said a CBS executive told him the corporation will not risk its assets on this story, period. By late 1995, CBS decides, okay, we'll have a part of the story, but we're not going to use Wingate's interview. Soon, articles started to appear in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that exposed major aspects of the story, partially because of calls Bergman made to those newspapers. The damage was done. CBS's credibility was in question. Bergman quit. The Wingate interview would be seen in 1996 after CBS was outed. The movie, The Insider, starred Al Pacino and Russell Crowe. Bergman's investigation of the tobacco industry and the subsequent breakup with 60 Minutes were the basis for the 1999 film The Insider, which starred Al Pacino as Bergman and Russell Crowe as Weingart. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. As far as 60 Minutes, well, Mike Wallace wasn't too happy with, I was going to say Perlmutter because I knew his mother, Alice Perlmutter, with Lowell. Bergman said his relationship with Mike Wallace and Don Hewitt never recovered. The two bosses sided with CBS over the interview. At a journalism conference in 2000, Hewitt denounced Bergman, saying he shouldn't be allowed within 100 miles of a newsroom. A year later, he called Bergman, supposedly to catch up. Bergman said he was busy, hung up. They never spoke again. And as they say in TV, we have to leave it at that. Censorship continues to this day on TV, sometimes because of business concerns and not national security. Well, I want to thank Donna for inviting me, and if anybody has any questions or